Today we're going to look at a little mini site that was created with PHP. So I'm going to show you first what it is comprised of, how it works, and then we'll dissect it and look inside the code to see what's going on. It's imperative that you get a web server running on your machine. So whether you have IIS installed or you install XAMPP or whatever, please do that as soon as possible if you have not already. If you're struggling with that, let me know, because if you continue to struggle with that, it's impossible for you to do the assignments. So make sure you get that done as soon as possible. Now, when you get a web server installed, you will have a certain folder that you need to place your code in. First of all, how do you know if you have IIS installed? Well, simply, if you have it installed and it's running, you type in localhost, you'll get something that looks like this. That means that you have IIS installed and running. The other thing you can look for is the folder CINET pub www. And if you have that, and you do not get this page when you go to localhost, you have it, but it's not set to run, and we can talk about that. At any rate, get things going on your machine for a web server. I'm going to copy everything from this example into my CINET pub www root, because having IIS, that is the folder that I need to put my stuff into. All right, now when I type in localhost, since I got rid of the old files and put my files in here, I get this. A little creation I made. Planet Zellers, fitness for IT people. I think that's a worthwhile goal. We spend so much time at our keyboards that it would be nice to get out and actually move once in a while. All right, so this is a little mini site. It has a home page that would describe the purpose of it. It then has a chart which shows you that depending on your age, what the range of your heart rate ought to be when exercising, and what the absolute maximum it ought to be. So in other words, if you are age 20, your heartbeat when exercising ought to be between 100 and 160 beats per minute. Going up to 60, between 80 and 128. This maximum is sort of like an absolute maximum. If it approaches that, you're probably exercising too hard. You should get it within this. Now, keep in mind, standard disclaimer, this is not medical advice. This is just something I pulled off of, it's a pretty standard calculation that is used that I pulled off the web. So there's a chart that shows you this. This chart is similar to the example we did last week, except it has a little more complicated calculation. Instead of just squaring the number, we actually do this range calculation and we do a maximum calculation. I then have a calculator, because if you notice, it has 60 and 65. If you want to calculate a specific age, 62, let's say I have 10 beats per 6 seconds. A lot of times when you take your pulse for 6 seconds. And so from 62, and my pulse is 10 beats per 6 seconds. I calculate it. It tells me that I am in the optimal exercise heart range. If I say that my pulse is 20 beats per 6 seconds, then I'm above the optimal heart range. If I say that I am 3 beats per 6 seconds, below. And finally, if I put something invalid in, oh, No validation done. What if I put something alphanumeric? Oh, it tells me that the beats are not a number. So this does server-side validation as well. Likewise, if I put something numeric for age. So we're going to go through this today and possibly next time to show you what this is comprised of. The first thing I want you to notice is that these pages have an identical layout to each other. In other words, it's HTML for the header, for the navigation, and for the footer is the same on all pages. Now, part of that is because we have common CSS code. But part of it is we have sort of a template in HTML that we have, and we implement that template using what are called include files in PHP. An include file is simply a file that is included in a web page that contains a section of code. What can that code be? That code can be anything that you can put in a PHP page. So the code in an include file could be HTML code. It could be JavaScript. It could be CSS. It could be PHP code. So anything that's allowable to have in a PHP file is allowable in an include file. Keep in mind, all a PHP file is a mix of a standard web page and all the stuff that belongs in it mixed with some PHP code. So an include file can be anything that you can put on a PHP page or in a PHP page. So let's look at the home page, which is index. By the way, if you notice when I type in localhost, it goes right to the index. Web servers, or when web servers are set up, they have defined the default files that they're looking for. That's why when you go to google.com, you don't put in the name of the page that you want on Google. There's a default page that you go to. Same thing here. That's why typically I will call my pages index.php, .html, or Razor pages, they're called index as well. So let's look at the home page, which is index.php. Let's open up in Visual Studio Code. All right, this looks like a standard web page. Type HTML tag, title, link to style sheet, body. Right here we have a PHP include. And down here at the footer we have a PHP conclude. So what I've done is I've separated my page into the different sections. This, and this are common on every page. This middle section here is distinct to the specific page. And what's in header include is the code for the header of the page. What's in navigation include is the navigation section, and what's in the footer is in the footer include file. So let's look at one of these. If I look at the header inc and I open it up in Visual Studio Code. All it is it's a section of the HTML that makes up the header file. So what happens when the server processes this page, and remember, a server has to process your PHP page. You have to request your PHP page through a server, which means you can't double click it and open it just like an HTML page. You have to request it from a server, because the PHP page itself is a set of instructions to create a web page, not a completed web page. All right? So what the web server does with this include is it effectively copies and pastes the code right here in the web page. So if we do a view source, we see there's the header. Paste it in there. And we have something similar for the nav. And we have something similar to for the footer. Now, the nice thing is that if we change it, we only need to make the change in one place. Those of you that have me for CISS216 know that typically when we develop HTML pages, we make a template that contains all the common code that's going to appear on every web page. We then clone that template for each of our specific pages. The problem with that is, after we've cloned them, if we want to go back and change some of that common code, we have to make that change in 5, 6, 7, 8, however many pages we have. Here, by breaking up the page into include files, there's one place to put the code. All right? There's a very common and often used programming rule of thumb. And that is DRY, which means do not repeat yourself. We do that all over the place in programming, right? We create classes in C# that contain code, so we don't have to duplicate code on a bunch of different pages or programs. We create a CSS file that contains the CSS. So all our CSS is confined in one place. So if we need to change it, we just change that one file. And now we're doing that with include files. So we're not repeating ourselves. This code normally, if this is a plain HTML file, would be pasted here. Instead, that's what the server does. Effectively, wherever it sees to include, it pastes that code into the output HTML. So we're not repeating ourselves. And that's a very good thing, because if I want to change something, for example, the date on this, I can change it to 2022, save it. Now, it's changed on this page. It's also changed on this page, change on this page. It's just like if we go into the CSS and change it. Change the color from, change the background of the header from gray to blue, let's say. That's red. I don't know my hex codes. That'd be 0000AA. Shade of blue. We make that change in one place in the CSS file. And change should get propagated. Here's a quirk. Notice that it didn't make the change. That's because the browser has not recognized that that web page has changed. What I often do to get around that problem is I'll click on this. Notice the background is still showing the old values. If I hit refresh, it changes it, and then I hit refresh the page. Oh, let's calculate. You know what? Yeah, I didn't open up. Did I? still has a cached version of this old version of the web page, and you run into this problem every now and then. There we go. Changed it to blue. Sometimes you have to wrestle with it a little bit to get it to be the way it's refreshing the page, pulling up the source code, pulling up the CSS files and refresh. I'm going to undo this because this looks ugly. And save again. That was, again, it's still stuck at blue, even though I made the change back to gray. I will refresh that. Oh. I click retry. And then we're back to gray. So if you made a change and it doesn't immediately take effect, it could be a caching issue on your browser, where the browser has stored an old copy of it. This is especially if you change like another file, like not the main HTML, but like the CSS file or an include file. Okay, so we use include file to put common HTML code or common any kind of code. All right. And that way we have the benefit of, if you want to change the CSS, you just change the CSS file. If you want to change the header, footer, or nav, and that's typically how I break down my include files, because you have a header, footer, and nav on every page. And you can make those changes to that without having to make them on every individual HTML file if you use that. Just include. All right, let's look at the chart page. Because the chart page is similar to what we did last time, but it's a little more expansive. It does a more involved calculation than just squaring a number. So let's look at the chart page. Chart page, as you might imagine, has include files for the header, nav, footer, but it also has an include file called heart.inc. Now, this page and this page are doing the same calculations, basically. It's outputting the data in different ways, but it's pretty much doing the same calculation, because both of them are calculating the range, the optimal heart range. And in one case, it's checking to see if your heart rate is within that range. In another case, it's showing you what that range is. So the calculations relating to heart are put in a separate include file. And that way, both of these pages can share it. So again, another use of an include file. We're not using the include file just to contain HTML, but we're using an include file to contain PHP code that's in common. And what is in that include file? There is a set of functions. There's actually 4 functions. One to calculate the maximum heart rate given an age. One that calculates the minimum heart rate. Or one that calculates the maximum rate period given the age. One creates the minimum of the exercise, the acceptable exercise heart rate given the age. And one that checks the maximum exercise rate given the age. And then finally, a function that accepts 3 arguments: the age, the number of beats the number of beats that the heart has, and how many seconds that reading was taken for. and it will return one of three values: a -1 if it's below range, a 0 if it's in range, and a 1 if it's above range. So that covers everything, right? This page is going to use that calculate in range function. So if I put in age and a number of heartbeats, this function is going to get called. For this chart, this function, and this function gets called. But, hint, hint, this function to calculate if it's in range calls the same code as the other page does. So the rule for calculating the minimum and maximum exercise heart range is only contained in one place. Why is that? Because why? We don't want to repeat ourselves. We don't want the code that calculates the maximum exercise heart rate or the minimum exercise heart rate to be on two different pages. So we put all that code in an include file, and both the pages share that one include file. So let's look at the chart. Include these PHP, well, let's look at the include file again a little bit closer, and then we'll look at the chart code. The include file has a list of functions. Functions are a critical thing for you to understand in programming. If you are at all confused about functions, you should talk to me. The way functions work is with a function, you define a block of code that you can call different times. Functions are a place to put common code, all right? So we're not repeating ourselves. Functions have two things about them. They have arguments and they have return values. The arguments are the information that the function needs to do its calculation. So for example, to calculate the minimum exercise heart rate, you need to know how old the person is. All right? Because it's not the same for a 20-year-old as it is for a 60-year-old. So that calculation requires you to know the age of the person. So that will be passed in as an argument to the function. Like in Excel, if I have a square root function, I have to specify what cell I want to calculate the square root of. I can't just say, give me the square root. Square root of what? Just like here, I can't say, give me the maximum heart rate. Maximum heart rate for what age? All right. Functions also have return values. And there can only be one return value per function. So in the case of calculate minimum exercise heart rate, it returns a number. Functions can return only one thing. And in what we're doing, what we're going to do, the functions are going to return probably numbers or strings or something like that. But functions can return, for example, in other cases, it can return an object. And if I'm getting a little ahead of you, if you're not really familiar with objects, file that away in the back of your head and know that functions can return one thing only, but that one thing can be pretty complicated. In our case, though, the one thing we're returning is not very complicated. It's simply one number. All of these return one number. So in all of these cases, the answer that is returned is one number. Now, what do I mean by returned? I mean, it gets sent back to whoever called the function in the first place. There's sort of two steps involved in using functions. There's defining the function. That's what this is doing. In PHP, the syntax is function, the name of the function, which doesn't begin with a $sign, it just begins with this, typically using capital letters where the first letter of each word is capitalized. In parentheses, we have any argument that we give. And at the bottom, we have a return that indicates the return. Curly brackets go around the start and the end of the function. That's just defining the function. We have to call that function. And we call that function by putting the name of the function and supplying the argument. So for example, on this page, on the chart, we have a for loop that says for age equals 20 until age, as long as age is less than or equal to 80, and increment age by 5 each time through the loop. End of the loop is down here. It gets a little tricky. That's why I suggest indenting your code. On occasion, I get code from students in many different languages where they have not properly indented. And no wonder it's hard for those students to find their errors. It's hard for me to find their errors because you can't see what is part of what. What is part of an if statement? What is part of a loop? What is part of a function? Whereas if you indent properly, you can easily see this lines up with this. So I know everything included in here is part of the loop. So we're going to execute this loop. We have a variable called $age. That's going to start off at 20. It's going to go as long as the age is less than or equal to 80. And it's going to increment by 5 years or 5 each time through the loop. So it'll be 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 55, 60, 65, 70, 75, 80. The next time through the loop, it's going to increment it to 85, and it will not execute the loop. So this is very similar to what I had last time. Each time through the loop, I'm outputting a TR. HTML, remember, gets sent as is to the browser. So the TR tag, the TD tag, and so on get sent. In here is a snippet of PHP code that's going to do whatever we say. In this case, we're outputting the value of the age. That's why on this one, in the first column of each row, we get the age, 20 through 80. We then create another TD that outputs the range. And what is the range? The range is calculate minimum exercise rate, calculate maximum exercise rate, and then format the output this way. Remember, with double quotes, if you include a variable in the string with double quotes, it gives you the value of that variable. So in this case, for 20, it calculates the minimum, the maximum, and then outputs the range, 100 to 160. Finally, it calculates the absolute maximum heart rate, which is 200. And outputs it out. So each time through the loop, it outputs a row. First column is the age, second column is the range, which includes the maximum and minimum, and then finally the absolute maximum for that age. We end the TD, and we're done. So here we are calling the function. We're calling the function and either printing it out or assigning it to a variable and formatting the output. Let's look at these functions. calculate min, calculate max, and minimum exercise, maximum exercise, and absolute maximum. The minimum is defined as 50% of the absolute maximum. So we calculate the absolute maximum first. The maximum exercise rate is 80% of the absolute maximum. In both cases, we need to calculate what that absolute maximum is first. So rather than having that code in two places, we call a function. That's exactly the purpose of functions. One thing that I've noticed that holds a lot of students back is an incomplete understanding of functions, why they're created, what they do, arguments, return values. So if you don't understand these, please talk to me about it. Now, the order of these statements matter. For example, I can't take 50% of the maximum until I've calculated the maximum. I can't return the answer until I've calculated it. So I get the maximum from this function. I get 50% of that maximum as the answer, and then I return the answer. Here I do the same thing, except it's 80%. And what is the calculation for calculating the absolute maximum? It is 220 minus your age. Now, this is an approximation. There's more accurate ways of doing it. But again, this is not meant to be exercise advice. This is just to demonstrate approximately how these calculations work. So when we calculate the minimum maximum, we pass the age that we want. In our case of the chart, the age is in the variable called age. Call the function minimum, calculates the maximum, takes 50% of that and returns it. It's the same thing for the maximum exercise rate, and then outputs them. And then finally, the last column is the absolute maximum, which is calculated this way. Notice that if there's a new scientific discovery that says that, well, actually this should be 200 minus their age. If research indicates that 220 is too high of a number, all we would have to do is put that change in one place. Or if they discover that the range should be 45% and not 50%. All we have to do is change the code in one place because we did not repeat ourselves. Now you might say we repeated ourselves here, where we called a function here and a function here. That part is inevitable. Repeated calls to a function are okay. It's the guts of the function that actually does the calculation that we don't want to repeat. All right, so that's our chart. Now let's get to the calculator, because the calculator has some more fun stuff in it. It has the ability to type in an age, type in how many beats in 6 seconds, and get a message whether you are in optimal heart range or not. It also has validation. We type something in that's not numeric, so it doesn't blow up. Now notice this. We could write JavaScript validation for this. And I think I do have an example of JavaScript validation out there, which we may have time to look at today. If we do not have time to look at it today, review it on your own time. Again, remember, this is a blended course, which means that I lecture 1 day a week. The remaining time, it's on you to go in, look at the materials, and understand them. Okay, let's look at the calculator. Calculator code is very simple. This actually does have a little bit of client-side validation too. I did this to demonstrate that validation should be in both places. If I don't put an age at all in here, immediately get a message. Notice the difference between these two validations. I don't put an age in, I immediately get an error message on the same page. If I put garbage in for the age, it submits to the server and then the server returns the error message. It's two different things. All right? Two different things. Now, in reality, if I was doing this for a real project, I would have the same validation on both sides. In this case, I have less validation on the client to demonstrate that that's what usually is the case. Let's say you're purchasing something from an online retailer, and you say you're gonna put in a credit card to pay for it, and you don't put any data in the credit card. All right, in the credit card field. If you press submit, then JavaScript can tell that you left that field blank, because that's a very simple, straightforward check. However, if you put in an invalid credit card number, for example, a credit card number that you just made up off the top of your head, JavaScript can't do that processing because that requires inquiring a database or some other operation. So typically, we put some very basic validation in JavaScript and more extensive validation on the server side. So JavaScript can make sure that you entered in a credit card number, that it's the right number of digits, that it's numbers and not letters. That it can do without inquiring any database or anything. But to make sure that that credit card is a real credit card number that was issued, that is your credit card number, that your special code matches the code that you entered, and your expiration date matches, and the name matches. All that has to be done on the server side because a database has to be inquired or some other check has to be done that has to take place on the server. What we're going to do first off, though, is we're going to ignore the validation. We're going to ignore the server-side validation. We'll probably come back to that next time. All right. How does the client-side validation work? Well, this really is just a basic HTML page with a form. Our action is check range. So check range will get called if this form is submitted. The method is get. So we're going to pass the information on the query string. And finally, we return the result of validate form. Now, this is JavaScript land, right? So this is not a PHP function. This is a JavaScript function. JavaScript cannot call that. There has to be special steps taken place for JavaScript to call a PHP function. All right? Call PHP code. Therefore, any code that you see JavaScript calling is probably going to be JavaScript code, at least in these simple examples. What does a validation do? It assumes the form is valid, blanks out the errors, make sure that we have not entered an empty string for that. Again, that is probably not a good check. I probably should trim it first to make sure to get rid of leading spaces. I can't just do space, space, space. I have to actually enter something in. So if when I trim it, there is nothing there, then it's not valid and my str errors is missing string. We set the inner HTML to that error message and return be valid. Now this is a little tricky coming up here. We return be valid. We return it to what? We return it to the onSubmit event because the onSubmit event is who called this. And we're returning that value to the onSubmit event. So therefore, if this returns a true, this is going to tell the onSubmit event, yeah, it's okay to process this. If it returns a false, we're going to return to the onSubmit event a false, which indicates that no, we have an error. Do not submit it. So if you return a false to the onSubmit event, that's an indication not to submit the page, to instead display the validation errors. I have another example of that posted in Canvas for you to take a look at. Now, when this is done, we're going to send on the query string txt age and txt beats. Let's look at check range file. This check range file has its own include file. Look how clean this code is. Now we're in PHP land. So when we say validate form, we're calling the PHP function validate form. And if it's valid, display the output. I put these in an include file just to make the code very clean. Because this check range code is probably not going to be shared for any other page. But here we have our validation function that's either going to return a true or false. And if it returns true, we're going to get the age. That's how you pull something from the query string. $_request. That will pull either from the query string for a get or the form collection if we do a post. We call the inRange function, which was declared in the hard include file. And if the result is -1, that means you're below the optimal exercise heart range. If it's equal to 0, you are in the exercise optimal heart range. And if it returns a 1, you're above it. Remember our heart include file. That function I wanted. It takes an argument of age, beats, and the number of seconds. Does the calculation and returns either a -1, a 1, or a 0. And means both these conditions have to be true. So beats per minute have to be greater or equal to minimum and less than or equal to the maximum. One thing I'm trying to demonstrate, by the way, and this is useful in programming, is sometimes it's okay to ignore the contents of a function if you're focusing on another function. So for example, in this case, I kind of said, hey, we're not really worried about the validation function. We know it's going to return either a true or a false. So this function is going to return a true or false. If it returns true, then we do a display output. And then look at what happens if it's true. we return and we call the display output function. A key thing for you is to understand how this indicates this pulls a value off the query string. This will be very useful when you do your Mad Lib because you will also need to pull variables off the query string. Noun 1, verb 1, adjective 1, color 1, whatever. Now that's a lot of stuff for one day. We will go over this in more detail next time. Especially go over the last one and probably review the other things too. If there are no other questions, that's all I had for this week. If there are questions, please email them to me. I can't emphasize enough the importance of getting help if you're stuck. I admire people that try to figure out things on their own, but in this class, you have someone whose job it is to help you learn this material. So if you're having trouble, please ask questions. All right, we'll see you next week.